Well, everyone, I never thought that I'd be saying this, but it looks like Apple's about to do something that Steve Jobs said he would never do, which is adding a touchscreen to a MacBook. I know, it's insane to think about. But in this video, I want to break down everything we know about this new touchscreen MacBook, the specs, the size, the display tech, why Apple's doing this, and then ultimately also talk about what's going to happen to the iPad lineup, specifically my beloved iPad Pro, because if you add a touchscreen to a MacBook Pro, maybe there's no need for an iPad Pro anymore. But let's talk about all this, break it down, and leave a comment down below what you guys think about a touchscreen MacBook, and if it's something that you have been yearning for, or if Apple should just stay away from this altogether. Let's get into it. But now, before we continue, if you do enjoy videos like this one where we break down all things Apple, consider subscribing to the channel and help us get to 1 million subscribers by the end of the year. But now, let's talk about this new touchscreen MacBook. So let's really quickly contextualize this timeline, because you might have heard that there's rumors of an M5 Pro and M5 Max MacBook releasing in Q1 of this year. So that's still going to be the case, and that's just going to be an iterative update to the current MacBook Pro lineup. So the design isn't going to change, it's going to be a spec bump internally, maybe a little bit better battery life, better efficiency, better AI improvements. So we're going to get the M5 Pro and the M5 Max MacBook Pro probably in the next month or two, depending on when Apple decides to release it, which could be released during this new March 4th event or experiences that we're going to get next week. But there's also these rumors that towards the end of the year, kind of the October-November timeframe, Apple's going to be bringing out a fully redesigned MacBook Pro with the first M6 chip to be inputted in any Apple device. So it should be a complete overhaul from a redesign standpoint. Think about going from the M1 MacBook Air to the M2 MacBook Air and how different those were. We're going to get something similar from the M5 MacBook Pro over to the M6 MacBook Pro. So again, in October, Apple should be putting a touchscreen onto their MacBook Pros, and it's kind of interesting because, like I said in the very beginning, Steve Jobs famously mentioned years and years ago that touchscreens on laptops are ergonomically terrible, and I've always been kind of against that. Like the whole idea of the two-in-ones, the flip over notebooks that we've seen in the past that kind of turn into a thick iPad or a thick tablet style situation. I don't think that's what's going to happen here with the MacBook Pro that has a touchscreen. They're still going to create the MacBook so it's not a touch-first input. It's not going to be the iPad. The iPad's always going to be a touch-first interface and input. It's going to be kind of a secondary and tertiary way of interacting with your MacBook Pro. So it's still going to be a keyboard and trackpad situation first and foremost, with the augmentation of adding touchscreen capabilities to your MacBook Pro. So that's what I think iPadOS 26 was in terms of adding those floating windows and adding kind of this Mac-like interface to the iPad. Apple's kind of foreshadowing what the new UI changes are going to be on the MacBook Pro when the M6 version comes out and it becomes touchscreen. For example, the UI is going to dynamically adapt depending on what input method you're using. So if it knows that you're using the trackpad to move things around, it'll kind of keep everything as is. But the moment that it senses that using a touch first input, you're going to get kind of things enlarging, the input points being a little bit bigger, very similar to how it currently works when you're using touch in the floating window situation on the iPad. If you go over to the traffic light management buttons on the iPad on iPadOS and you use your finger to touch on it first, the first touch actually enlarges everything, so you have an easier way to actually touch on whatever you need to touch in order to get that done and get whatever you need to move around done correctly. So something similar is coming to the UI on macOS. And some other UI elements that are coming that are going to be touch triggered is going to be similar to what Logitech has been doing with their MX Master 4. They added a new haptic feedback button where if you press on it, it gives you all these new context menus depending on what application you're in. So maybe if you're in Photoshop and you touch the screen, a bunch of new context menu buttons show up in that area. If you're in Safari, something similar will happen that's going to be different than what you see on Photoshop. So a lot of contextual menus happening when you are using the touch first interface. And then, of course, Apple's going to be bringing a lot of iOS gestures, right? The scrollability, the swiping up to remove things, the multitasking gestures. So Apple should be bringing a lot of that over to the macOS interface. So again, it's still going to be a trackpad and keyboard input first, but there's going to be a lot of methods to use your touch first input. And I've always said that at the end of the day, over the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a convergence in operating systems. We're going to end up picking your form factor, whether it's an iPhone, an iPad, a MacBook, and they're all pretty much going to do the same thing, just in different screen sizes and in different scenarios. So Apple is set to remove the mini LED display from the MacBook Pro and add an OLED display that's going to align with the rest of the Apple lineup in that Pro level moniker with the iPad Pro and the rest of Apple's design roadmap. So adding OLED is going to give you deeper blacks, better contrast, a lower power consumption, and then ultimately a thinner display, meaning that the MacBook might actually be thinner than we anticipated. And then Apple is set to remove the notch from the MacBook Pro and add a dynamic island. I'm hoping that this means that we're finally going to get Face ID on the MacBook, because that's something that I've been yearning for years. Touch ID works great in the situations, it's fast, the biometric scan is very secure, but Face ID is just so much better in every single way, especially when you're using it on the iPad. I hate Touch ID on iPads. Touch ID on MacBooks is fine, but again, bringing Face ID would be great. but then all the different UI changes with the dynamic island will come over, right? All the notification menus, the airdrop progress menu bar, everything will kind of adapt around it, and it'll be, again, dynamic like it is in the name with the dynamic island. And I've already seen developers do some awesome things with the notch on the MacBook Pro, so bringing that over into a dynamic island UI, or maybe Apple Intelligence and Siri gets a little bit smarter, and it lives in that little dynamic island. Let's see exactly what Apple does from a UI perspective to merge that hardware and software with the dynamic island and the OLED display on the new MacBook Pro. And then like I said, this is going to be the first MacBook or first product to have the M6 chip, which should be faster, built for Apple Intelligence, more efficient, and it's going to be built on a newer process node, meaning they can fit even more transistors and more billions and billions of numbers into these little chips. So again, it's just going to be faster and it's going to be the latest and greatest, and I'm sure there's going to be a little bit in there to deal with touch as well. So why is Apple doing this? In my opinion, like I said earlier, I do think that Apple's going to end up converging all of their software together into one piece of software. It's just going to be like iOS or Apple OS across everything, whether it is your iPhone, your Vision Pro, your MacBook, your iPad, and it's just going to depend on what piece of hardware you want to use for that current situation. So I think that's what's happening here. Apple has already evolved the iPadOS ecosystem and the iOS ecosystem in that touch-first interface, and they see utility finally in bringing touch over to your MacBook Pro. But again, let's see exactly how Apple implements this and why their marketing version of why we should be getting touchscreen MacBooks will be coming later in October. But now, what is this going to mean for people like myself that love the iPad Pro and try to use their iPad Pro as their main computer day to day? Does that mean that now the MacBook Pro makes the iPad Pro completely obsolete? Because think about it. It pretty much brings all the best in terms of touchscreen, in terms of display tech with the OLED display, but then you also get the laptop-esque piece of it with the trackpad, macOS, the keyboard. So it really just depends on what's going to happen with MacBook Pro and making sure that they don't cannibalize the iPad Pro. So I do think that the iPad Pro will become even more specialized in terms of who's going to want to end up using it, because again, the iPad Pro will still remain more versatile, right? You can still remove it from the keyboard, use it like a true tablet. It's still going to be lighter and thinner. You're still going to have Apple Pencil support. I don't think Apple Pencil support will be coming to the MacBook Pro, at least for a very long time, because it's just not built for that type of situation from a ergonomic standpoint. Like, again, those displays are so thin that if you use a trackpad, like if you use an Apple Pencil, it'll just kind of wobble everything around, which wouldn't make sense for the Apple Pencil. But again, let's see what ends up happening with the iPad Pro if Apple does bring out this touchscreen MacBook, and I guess what kind of similarities and the Venn diagram overlap is going to happen between iPadOS and macOS. So again, I love my iPad Pro, and I've pushed it to the limits in terms of creating and making it my computer. I've dealt with the ups and downs, I've dealt with all the nuance, I've dealt with all the different kind of friction that comes with using iPadOS. So if Apple brings touch to macOS, we're going to have a different conversation here in terms of what is going to be my main computer moving forward, but that's just a personal decision, and I do think there's room for both devices. It's just a matter of who's going to be able to want to spend the kind of money to get both devices. So now, should you wait for this M6 MacBook Pro? It really depends on where you're coming from, right? If you currently have maybe an M2, an M3, or an M4 MacBook Pro, and it's still running smoothly, it's running fine, even if it's a MacBook Air with an M2 chip, I would say hold off and wait for the M6 version of this MacBook Pro, because it is going to be a beautiful redesign. It's going to be the first time Apple puts a new piece of tech into the MacBook Pro with OLED and touchscreen. Again, if you're in dire need of getting an M5 MacBook Pro that's coming out probably in the early stages of March, then for sure, you know who you are, jump on it, and it's still going to be a great device for a long time. But if you're willing to wait the 6 months to kind of see what Apple ends up releasing with the M6 MacBook Pro, then I do recommend waiting, because I think it's going to be well worth the wait to see exactly what Apple does with the M6 version of the MacBook Pro. So again, at the end of the day, Apple spent decades kind of justifying the fact that they never put a touchscreen on a Mac because it's not what Steve Jobs wanted. Ergonomically, it didn't make sense. You're kind of hunched over. And most of those were pretty much trying to use a finger to replace a cursor, which was impossible. The cursor point is so minuscule and tiny that the touch-first interface just can't be that exact. So now that Apple has kind of evolved iPadOS to work and look like macOS, but work alongside touch, I think Apple now understands that it has matured enough and that they can bring a lot of those UI elements and those kind of enlargement UI pieces, so you can have a great experience using touch on something that's not really meant to work with touch. But if you've seen, macOS is looking more and more like iPadOS and vice versa. So let me know in the comment down below what you think. Is Apple doing the right thing by adding touch to a MacBook Pro? Is that something that you've wanted from a MacBook Pro, from macOS to have touchscreen? Are you worried about what's going to happen to the iPad, especially the iPad Pro at that price point? There'll always be room for the iPad mini, the form factor, maybe even the iPad Air and the entry-level iPad. But if the MacBook Pro is going to get the same tandem OLED display and the same screen tech and be touchscreen, what's going to happen for the iPad Pro or to the iPad Pro? At that point, then it just becomes a versatility play and the ability to remove it and use it as a tablet. Is that worth over $1,000 for most people? I would say no. So let me know in the comment down below what you think. If you made it to the end, leave a little dolphin. I'm very interested and excited to see what Apple's going to be doing moving forward. But if you guys want to watch more videos like this one, check out one of these videos right here. Until next time, I'm Fernando. Peace. Touchscreen MacBook. Never thought I'd see the day.